She thought she broke him. She had no idea what was coming. He stood in the same place every morning, shoulders slightly forward, eyes steady but guarded. Eyes steady but guarded, listening to words that were never meant to build him up. Day after day, the pattern repeated itself so consistently that it almost felt normal. A comment here, a laugh there, a reminder, subtle or sharp, that he was somehow less capable, less intelligent, worthy of respect. She delivered it with confidence, sometimes with humor, sometimes with impatience, and often with the ease of someone who believed they were simply stating facts. To the outside world it looked harmless, even justified. After all, he didn't protest, he didn't argue, he didn't push back, and silence in a noisy world is often mistaken for weakness. But what no one saw was the weight he carried home each day. The quiet moments when the words replayed in his mind, not as echoes of defeat, but as questions. Is this true? Is this all I am? Is this all I will ever be? Those questions hurt, but they also did something else. They forced him inward. And in that inward place, far from the noise and judgment, something important was happening. He was learning who he was without the labels placed on him by others. She believed power came from control, from being heard, from being seen as dominant. She believed that confidence meant standing above someone else. And because the world often rewards loudness, she had never been challenged on that belief. He, on the other hand, was learning a different lesson, one that rarely gets applause. He was learning restraint. He was learning patience. He was learning how to absorb pain without letting it poison him. That is not an easy thing to do. It takes more strength to remain grounded under pressure than it does to strike back in anger. There were moments, of course, when he wanted to respond. Moments when his chest tightened, when his jaw clenched, when one sentence could have turned the room silent. But he understood something deeper than pride. He understood timing. He understood that reacting might feel powerful for a moment, but it would not change the story. Growth would. So instead of arguing, he worked. Instead of defending himself, he developed himself. While others talked, he practiced. While others judged, he studied. While others underestimated him, he prepared. Pain has a strange way of revealing character. For some, it hardens the heart and narrows the mind. For others, it becomes a teacher. He chose to learn from it. Every insult became a reminder of what he still needed to master. Every dismissal became motivation. He did not romanticize the suffering. He acknowledged it, felt it, and then used it. Not to seek revenge, but to build competence. Skill by skill, habit by habit, day by day. There was no dramatic turning point at first, no single moment where everything suddenly changed. The transformation was quiet, almost invisible. But quiet changes are often the most powerful because they are rooted, not reactive. His posture began to change, not forced but natural. His voice became steadier, not louder, but clearer. His decisions became sharper, not rushed but confident. People didn't notice at first. They rarely do. Growth doesn't announce itself, she continued, unaware that the dynamic was shifting beneath her feet. The words that once landed heavily now passed through him with less impact. Not because they stopped hurting entirely, but because they no longer defined him. He had outgrown the need for her approval. And when you no longer seek approval, you cannot be controlled by disapproval. Eventually, results began to surface. Work that spoke for itself, insight that surprised people, consistency that could not be ignored. Others started asking for his opinion, not out of pity, but out of respect. The room felt different when he spoke, not because he demanded attention, but because his words carried substance. Silence followed him now, not as dismissal, but as focus. And then came the moment she did not expect. A moment without confrontation, without raised voices, without bitterness. Reality simply presented itself. The man she had underestimated was now someone she had to acknowledge. Not because he proved her wrong directly, but because his presence made denial impossible. Strength, when it is real, does not need to announce itself. It reveals itself through consistency, clarity, and impact. Her reaction was complex: surprise, discomfort, reflection. It is never easy to realize that your judgment of someone was incomplete, or worse, wrong, especially when that judgment once made you feel powerful. But this story is not about her downfall. It is about his rise. And more importantly, it is about the kind of rise that does not require someone else to fall. He did not humiliate her. He did not remind her of the past. He did not replay the insults. He simply continued forward. That, perhaps, was the most powerful statement of all, because true strength does not seek validation through dominance. It seeks purpose through growth. And this is where the lesson lives, not just in his story, but in ours. We live in a world that celebrates noise, speed, and visibility. We are taught to respond immediately, to defend ourselves loudly, to prove our worth constantly. But some of the strongest transformations happen away from the spotlight. They happen in the early mornings, in the quiet evenings, in the decisions no one claps for. They happen when you choose discipline over drama, progress over pride, and patience over ego. If you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, or belittled, understand this: the way others see you is not the limit of who you can become. Silence is not weakness, humility is not submission, endurance is not defeat. Sometimes it is preparation. Your hidden strength may be growing right now, unnoticed and uncelebrated. That does not make it any less real. In fact, it may make it stronger, because when strength is built quietly, it lasts. And when it finally shows itself, it doesn't need permission. It simply changes everything. He learned early what it felt like to be diminished in small, daily ways. Not through dramatic cruelty, but through repetition, a tone that carried impatience, a look that lingered just long enough to suggest disappointment, words that sounded casual to others but landed with precision on him. She spoke as if authority belonged naturally to her, as if his presence was something to be tolerated rather than respected. And because she spoke often and confidently, people listened. Because he did not interrupt, they assumed he agreed. Silence, after all, is easy to misinterpret. Each day followed the same rhythm. He showed up prepared, steady, observant. She questioned him, corrected him, sometimes mocked him, sometimes dismissed his contributions before they fully formed. It happened so frequently that it blended into the background noise of life. And yet, inside him, nothing about it felt ordinary. Words have weight. Even when you do not respond, your body remembers them, your mind replays them, your heart absorbs them. There were evenings when he sat alone, replaying moments, wondering whether he should have spoken, whether his restraint made him complicit in his own belittlement. But something unusual happened in that silence. Instead of turning outward in resentment, he turned inward in reflection. He began asking himself questions that had nothing to do with her. What did he actually want to become? What skills was he missing? What discipline had he avoided? What habits needed to change if he was serious about his own growth? These questions were uncomfortable, but they were honest. And honesty, unlike approval, creates progress. She believed strength was visible. It had to be asserted, claimed, reinforced through dominance. Her confidence came from comparison, from standing higher because someone else stood lower. It was a structure that depended on imbalance. He, however, was learning a different architecture of strength, one built quietly, internally, without witnesses. He realized that reacting would only keep him trapped in her frame. Every argument would make her central. Every defense would keep him defined by her judgment. So he chose a harder path. He chose self-mastery. He started arriving earlier, leaving later, practicing when no one asked him to, studying what others ignored, refining what others rushed through. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't immediate. There were no compliments waiting for him at the end of those long days. But there was something else: progress. Subtle at first, almost invisible, but real. And real progress has a way of changing how you carry yourself, even before it changes how others see you. The belittlement did not stop. If anything, it intensified at moments, as if she sensed that something was shifting but could not yet name it. Sometimes, when people feel their influence weakening, they grow louder, sharper, more dismissive. But her words began to lose their power over him. Not because they suddenly became kind, but because they no longer reached the core of his identity. He was no longer measuring himself by her reactions. He was measuring himself by his own standards. Yom pain, he discovered, could be destructive or instructive. The difference lay in how you used it. He stopped asking why this was happening to him and started asking what it was preparing him for. That shift changed everything. Each insult became a reminder of how far he still wanted to go. Each dismissal became motivation to close another gap in his abilities. He did not need her to change. He needed himself to grow. Over time, the internal work began to surface externally. His responses became clearer. His ideas more structured, his execution more consistent. When he spoke, it was no longer tentative. It wasn't aggressive either. It was grounded. People started listening, not because they felt obligated, but because what he said made sense, because it added value. Because it was reliable, respect began forming quietly, the way trust always does. She noticed the shift before she admitted it to herself. The dynamic that once felt effortless now required adjustment. Interrupting him no longer silenced him. Dismissing his ideas no longer ended the discussion. Others began turning toward him, seeking clarification, asking follow-up questions, building on his contributions. The room itself felt different. Not tense, just balanced. And balance can feel threatening when you are used to standing above. Still, there was no confrontation, no dramatic reversal, no public reckoning. That is not how real change often looks. Instead, there was a gradual unveiling of truth. The man once seen as lesser was now clearly competent. The one once overlooked was now dependable. The one once belittled had become steady. And steadiness, unlike dominance, endures. And when the moment came that made everything undeniable, it was almost anticlimactic. A situation arose that required judgment, skill, and composure. No theatrics, just pressure. And under that pressure, he did not falter, he did not rush, he did not defer. He acted with clarity built from months, even years of quiet preparation. The outcome spoke for itself. No explanation needed. Her reaction was restrained but revealing. There was a pause where confidence once flowed easily, a hesitation where certainty once lived. She had not lost her voice, but it no longer carried unquestioned authority. The realization settled in slowly. The strength she had dismissed had not disappeared. It had been developing. Out of sight, out of reach, and now fully present. Yet what mattered most was not her recognition. It was his response to it. He did not savor the reversal. He did not replay the past. He did not seek apology or acknowledgement. He simply continued as he had been, focused, grounded, forward-moving. That was the final transformation, the absence of bitterness, the refusal to let yesterday's wounds dictate today's behavior. This is where the deeper lesson emerges. True strength is not proven by overpowering others. It is revealed by consistency under pressure. It is built when no one is watching and tested when everyone is. The world teaches us to respond immediately, to defend loudly, to prove ourselves constantly. But some battles are won not through reaction, but through evolution. If you have ever felt diminished by someone else's words, understand this: their voice does not define your value. Their perception does not set your ceiling. Silence, when chosen intentionally, can be a strategy, not a surrender. Growth, when pursued patiently, becomes undeniable. You do not need to announce your strength while you are building it. You only need to keep building, because one day, without drama or declaration, the balance will shift. And when it does, it will not be because you demanded respect. It will be because your presence makes dismissal impossible. He did not expect respect when he first walked into that space. He only hoped for fairness. But fairness never came. Instead, what met him each day was a steady erosion of dignity, delivered not with cruelty loud enough to provoke outrage, but with a confidence sharp enough to cut. She spoke over him, corrected him publicly, reduced his efforts to something ordinary, sometimes even laughable. The pattern was so consistent that it began to feel intentional. And perhaps it was. She carried herself as someone certain of her position, certain of her authority, certain that she stood higher and he stood below. To everyone watching, it seemed like a natural order. He was quiet. She was commanding. And the world tends to accept hierarchies without asking how they were built. At first, the weight of it pressed heavily on him. Words lingered longer than they should have. Moments replayed in his mind late at night, when silence made room for doubt. He wondered whether his restraint was a flaw, whether his refusal to argue was proof that she was right. It is a dangerous place to be, that space where someone else's voice begins to sound like your own inner critic. Yet even in that uncertainty, something within him resisted surrender, not loudly, not defiantly, but persistently. Kale, he began to notice something important. Her power depended on his reaction. The more she dismissed him, the more she seemed to expect a response: defensiveness, frustration, submission. When it did not come, she filled the silence with more words. He realized then that reacting would only keep him trapped inside a story she controlled. So he chose another route. He chose observation. He listened not just to what she said, but to how she said it. He studied the environment, the expectations, the unspoken rules. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, his focus shifted away from surviving her behavior and towards strengthening himself. This shift did not make the days easier at first. In some ways, it made them harder. Growth requires honesty, and honesty can be uncomfortable. He had to confront his own weaknesses without using her behavior as an excuse. He had to admit where he lacked skill, where he hesitated, where he needed discipline. That process was humbling. But unlike humiliation, humility offered something in return: direction. Each weakness identified became a point of effort. Each limitation acknowledged became a challenge to overcome. While she continued to speak, he continued to work. Quietly, consistently, without announcement. He refined his abilities when no one asked him to. He practiced patience when frustration would have been easier. He learned to articulate his thoughts with clarity, not speed. He paid attention to details others ignored. None of this brought immediate recognition. In fact, it often went unnoticed. But it brought something more valuable than attention. It brought competence. And competence changes how a person stands in the world. Over time, the emotional impact of her belittlement began to weaken. The words still came, but they landed differently. They no longer pierced his sense of self because his identity was no longer shaped in reaction to her. He was building an internal standard, one that did not fluctuate with someone else's mood or opinion. This did not make him cold or detached, it made him grounded, and grounding creates resilience. There were moments when others began to notice subtle changes: his calm under pressure, his reliability, the way he spoke less but said more. People started turning toward him in discussions, not because he demanded attention, but because his presence felt steady. Trust does not announce itself, it accumulates. And slowly, trust was accumulating around him. She noticed too, though perhaps unwillingly, the dynamic that once felt effortless now required effort. Interruptions no longer silenced him. Dismissive remarks no longer ended conversations. When she challenged him, his responses were measured, clear, and difficult to undermine. This unsettled her, not because he became aggressive, but because he became unmovable. Strength that is loud can be confronted. Strength that is calm must be reckoned with. Still, there was no dramatic shift, no single day when everything changed. The transformation continued quietly, beneath the surface, until the moment arrived when preparation met necessity. A situation emerged that demanded judgment, composure, and depth. There was no room for posturing, no time for dominance. Only results mattered. And in that moment, the man who had spent so long being underestimated stepped forward naturally, not to prove himself, but because he was ready. He handled the pressure with a steadiness that surprised those watching. Decisions were made thoughtfully, actions were precise. The outcome was clear, no explanation was needed. The room understood what had happened before anyone spoke. Reality has a way of clarifying what words cannot. Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A pause where certainty once flowed freely. A recalibration of tone, not defeat, but recognition. The strength she had dismissed had not vanished or broken under her scrutiny. It had matured, and maturity, unlike bravado, cannot be ignored. What mattered most, however, was not that she noticed. It was how he responded to being seen. He did not seek acknowledgement. He did not revisit old wounds. He did not change his posture to signal victory. He remained consistent, focused, forward-moving. That consistency was the final proof of transformation. Because anyone can rise once. Only those who are truly grounded can remain steady afterward. The story then is not about belittlement or reversal. It is about the nature of strength itself. We often imagine strength as something immediate and visible, something proven through confrontation or dominance. But some of the most enduring strength is built quietly, through restraint, discipline, and self-respect. It grows when you choose not to become what hurts you, when you refuse to let bitterness shape your character, when you decide that your response will be defined by who you want to become, not by how you are treated. For anyone who has ever been diminished by someone else's words, this story offers a reminder. You do not have to announce your worth while you are still building it. You do not have to fight every battle to win the war. Silence, when chosen intentionally, can be powerful. Growth, when pursued patiently, becomes undeniable. And when your hidden strength finally reveals itself, it does not arrive with noise or revenge. It arrives with presence. And that presence changes everything. He entered that environment with a simple intention, to do his work well and to be treated with basic respect. What he encountered instead was a slow, persistent erosion of confidence delivered through routine interactions that seemed small on the surface, but accumulated into something heavy. She questioned him publicly, dismissed his contributions, and spoke to him as though his presence required justification. It was not always harsh. Often it was subtle. An eyebrow raised, a sentence cut short, a laugh that arrived a second too early. There, to those watching, it appeared ordinary, even harmless. To him, it was a daily reminder that he was not seen as equal. At first, he tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was under pressure. Maybe she didn't realize how her words landed. Maybe if he worked harder, spoke clearer, proved himself faster, the tone would change. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the pattern remained. Each encounter carried the same message: you are smaller than you think. Over time, that message begins to echo internally. Even the strongest minds are not immune to repetition. There were moments when anger rose in him, sharp and immediate. Moments when he imagined responding with force, matching her tone, reclaiming ground through confrontation. But each time, he paused. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. Something within him understood that reacting would give temporary relief but long-term cost. It would tether his growth to her behavior. It would make his progress dependent on winning arguments rather than building substance. So he chose restraint, even when restraint felt unfair. Restraint, however, does not mean passivity. While his outer response remained calm, his inner world was anything but idle. He began observing carefully his own habits, his skills, his weaknesses. He asked himself difficult questions. Where am I still uncertain? What do I avoid because it exposes my limitations? What would excellence look like if no one were watching? These questions were uncomfortable because they removed works. They shifted responsibility inward. And once responsibility moves inward, change becomes possible. She continued to assert herself, confident in her position and in the dynamic she believed was fixed. Her sense of strength came from visibility, from being heard, from shaping the room around her voice. He, meanwhile, was learning a quieter form of power, one that did not depend on comparison or control, one that grew through consistency. While she spoke, he studied. While she criticized, he practiced. While she underestimated, he refined. This process was slow, painfully slow at times. There were no markers to celebrate, no applause to reassure him that his effort mattered. Progress showed itself in small ways: a clearer thought, a steadier response, a task completed with greater precision. These were victories no one noticed, but they accumulated, and accumulation is how real strength is built. As months passed, something began to change within him. The words that once lingered painfully now passed through with less force. They stopped hurting entirely, but because they no longer reached the core of who he believed himself to be. He was no longer measuring his worth against her opinion. He was measuring it against his own evolving standard. That shift created distance, emotional distance that protected him from being defined by dismissal. Others began to sense it before they could name it. His presence felt different. He spoke less often, but when he did, people listened. His calm under pressure stood out. His work required fewer explanations because it was thorough. Trust began forming quietly, the way it always does, through reliability, not performance. Respect followed, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through consistency. She noticed too. The dynamic that once felt effortless began to feel strained. Her interruptions no longer unsettled him. Her dismissive remarks no longer ended discussions. When she challenged him, he responded without defensiveness, with clarity that left little room for dismissal. This was unfamiliar territory for her. Loud strength can be confronted, calm strength forces reflection. Still, there was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of public reversal. Real transformations rarely announce themselves. Instead, there was a gradual shift in balance. Conversations began to include him by default. Decisions began to rely on his input. When challenges arose, eyes turned toward him, not out of sympathy but out of confidence. The room was recalibrating. Then came a situation that demanded more than confidence or authority. It demanded judgment, composure, and depth. There was pressure. There were consequences. And there was no space for posturing. In that moment, preparation mattered more than presence. And he was prepared. He stepped forward naturally, not to prove himself, but because it was the logical thing to do. His actions were measured, his decisions clear. He did not rush or hesitate. He simply applied what he had been building quietly for so long. The outcome spoke for itself. No speech. No justification. Reality settled the matter. The shift was unmistakable. The man once dismissed was now undeniable. The one once spoken over was now listened to. Not because power had been taken from someone else, but because competence had revealed itself fully. Strength did not arrive with noise or drama. It arrived with clarity. Her response was subtle but telling. A pause where certainty once flowed freely. A change in tone. Recognition without confession. It is never easy to confront the limits of your own judgment, especially when that judgment once made you feel secure. But this story is not about her realization. It is about his transformation. What defined him in that moment was not triumph, but restraint. He did not revisit the past. He did not seek acknowledgement. He did not allow old wounds to shape new behavior. He remained consistent, focused on the work, grounded in himself, moving forward. That consistency was the final proof that the strength he had built was real. Anyone can rise once. Only those with depth can remain steady afterward. This story carries a lesson that reaches far beyond one relationship or one environment. We live in a culture that rewards immediacy, visibility, and reaction. We are encouraged to defend ourselves loudly, to prove our worth constantly, to equate silence with defeat. But some of the most powerful growth happens away from the spotlight. It happens when you choose discipline over drama, patience over pride, and self-mastery over short-term validation. If you have ever felt diminished by someone else's words, understand this: their perception is not your ceiling. Their voice is not your identity. Being quiet does not mean being weak. Sometimes it means you are listening, learning, and preparing. Strength built quietly lasts longer because it is not dependent on circumstance or approval. Hidden strength does not announce itself. It reveals itself when it is ready, through presence, through consistency, through impact. And when it does not need to take anything from anyone else to stand tall. It simply stands. And in doing so, it changes everything. From the outside, it looked like a familiar dynamic, one that many people have witnessed but few truly understand. She occupied the space with confidence, certainty, and volume. Her words arrived quickly, often cutting through conversations before they fully formed. His presence, by contrast, was quieter. He listened more than he spoke. He observed before he acted. And because the world often mistakes quiet for weakness, the imbalance went largely unquestioned. Day after day she diminished him, not always with cruelty but with consistency. A dismissive comment here, a public correction there, a tone that suggested superiority without ever stating it outright. Over time, those moments added up, shaping how others perceived him and, at times, how he struggled not to perceive himself. In the beginning, he tried to understand it logically. Perhaps she believed she was helping. Perhaps this was simply her way of asserting leadership. Perhaps, if he adjusted, spoke faster, pushed harder, asserted himself more aggressively, the treatment would change. But each attempt to adapt externally brought the same result. The more he tried to fit into her frame, the smaller he felt. And that realization forced him into a deeper reckoning. The problem was not simply how she treated him. The problem was whether he would allow that treatment to define the limits of who he could become. Kenker. There were nights when he replayed conversations in his mind, imagining responses he never gave. Not because he lacked the words, but because he sensed that words alone would not change the underlying reality. Confrontation might satisfy pride, but it would not build substance. Anger might feel justified, but it would not create progress. Slowly, he began to see restraint not as surrender, but as strategy. Silence, when chosen deliberately, could be a form of control, not over others, but over oneself. With that shift came responsibility. If he was no longer going to blame her behavior for his frustration, he had to confront his own shortcomings honestly. Was the hardest part. He examined where he hesitated, where his skills were incomplete, where fear disguised itself as patience. This process stripped away excuses. It was uncomfortable, even humbling, but it was also clarifying. Each weakness identified became a direction for effort. Each limitation acknowledged became a plan. While the external dynamic remained unchanged, an internal transformation began. He invested time in learning when no one asked him to. He practiced clarity of thought, not just speed of response. He refined his work beyond what was required, knowing that excellence does not announce itself immediately, but reveals itself eventually. There were no rewards for this effort at first, no recognition, no validation. But there was progress, and progress, even when unseen, has weight. She continued as before, confident in a hierarchy she believed was fixed. Her sense of strength came from comparison, from occupying the higher ground. His strength, still forming, came from consistency. While she asserted, he accumulated. While she spoke, he studied. While she dismissed, he improved. This contrast mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Gradually, something subtle began to shift. Her words no longer carried the same emotional charge for him. They still reached his ears, but they no longer defined his worth. He had begun to measure himself against his own standards, not her reactions. This created a quiet independence. He was no longer seeking approval, which meant he was no longer vulnerable to disapproval. That internal freedom changed how he carried himself. His posture relaxed. His voice steadied. His responses became deliberate rather than defensive. Others noticed before she did. People began to rely on him, not because he demanded authority, but because he proved dependable. His calm under pressure stood out. His work required fewer explanations because it was thorough. Trust formed quietly, the way it always does, through repeated evidence, not performance. Respect followed naturally, without announcement. When she finally noticed, it was not because he had challenged her openly. It was because the dynamic no longer worked the way it once had. Interruptions no longer unsettled him. Dismissive remarks no longer ended conversations. When she questioned him, his responses were clear, grounded, and difficult to undermine. This unsettled her, not because he became aggressive, but because he became solid. Loud strength can be confronted. Quiet strength forces reassessment. Still, there was no dramatic moment of reversal, no public confrontation, no apology. Real change rarely looks like that. Instead, the balance continued to shift incrementally. Conversations began to include him by default. Decisions began to lean on his judgment. When challenges arose, attention turned toward him, not out of sympathy but out of confidence. The environment itself was adjusting to a reality that could no longer be ignored. Then came a moment that required more than confidence or authority. A situation emerged where outcomes mattered more than appearances. Pressure replaced posturing, results replaced rhetoric. In that moment, preparation mattered, and he was prepared not because of talent alone, but because of the discipline built during months of being underestimated. He stepped forward without hesitation or spectacle. His actions were measured, his decisions steady. There was no need to prove anything. He simply applied what he had been building quietly all along. The outcome was clear. The room understood before anyone spoke. Reality, when it arrives, needs no explanation. Her reaction was subtle but telling, a pause where certainty once lived, a recalibration of tone. Recognition without acknowledgement. It is difficult to confront the limits of your own judgment, especially when that judgment once reinforced your sense of control. But again, this story is not about her realization. It is about his response to it. What defined him in that moment was not triumph, but restraint. He did not revisit the past. He did not seek validation. He did not allow old wounds to shape new behavior. He remained consistent, focused on the work, grounded in himself, moving forward. That consistency revealed the deepest layer of strength, the ability to rise without becoming hardened, to succeed without needing someone else to fall. This story carries lessons that extend far beyond one relationship or one environment. We live in a culture that rewards immediacy, visibility, and reaction. We are encouraged to defend ourselves loudly, to prove our worth constantly, to equate silence with defeat. But some of the most enduring strength is built away from the spotlight. It grows through patience, discipline, and self-respect. It forms when you refuse to let bitterness become your identity. If you have ever been belittled, underestimated, or dismissed, understand this. The way others see you is not the boundary of who you can become. Silence, when chosen intentionally, can be powerful. Restraint, when guided by purpose, can be transformative. Growth pursued quietly becomes undeniable over time. Hidden strength does not announce itself. It reveals itself when it is ready, through presence, through consistency, through impact. And when it does not need to dominate or humiliate to stand tall. It simply stands. And in doing so, it changes everything. He entered that chapter of his life without expecting praise or special treatment. All he wanted was the chance to contribute, to grow, to be judged by effort rather than assumption. But almost immediately a pattern formed. She spoke with authority and certainty, often correcting him before he finished a sentence, often reducing his ideas to something small or obvious. It wasn't always harsh. Sometimes it was framed as humor. sometimes as instruction, sometimes as impatience. But the message was consistent: you are beneath me. And because it happened daily, it carried a weight far heavier than a single insult ever could. At first, he tried to brush it off. He told himself that confidence often looks like dominance, that some people simply communicate that way. He focused on staying calm, professional, and composed. Yet composure does not make words disappear. They accumulate. And over time, those small moments of belittlement began to shape the atmosphere around him. Others started speaking over him too. Opportunities bypassed him. Silence followed his contributions. Not because he lacked value, but because perception had already been shaped. There were nights when he questioned himself deeply. Not in anger, but in quiet confusion. Was he too passive? Was he invisible because he allowed himself to be? Or was there something deeper unfolding that he could not yet see? These questions did not weaken him. They sharpened him. They forced him to look inward rather than outward for answers. He noticed something crucial. Reacting never changed the pattern. When he defended himself, it fed the dynamic. When he explained himself, it reinforced the assumption that he owed justification. So he stopped trying to correct her perception with words. Instead, he chose to correct his trajectory with action. This was the first shift. The decision to stop seeking validation from the very source that withheld it. While the external environment remained unchanged, his inner discipline intensified. He studied not just his work, but himself. He examined where hesitation crept in, where fear disguised itself as politeness, where preparation could replace anxiety. He began arriving earlier, staying later, refining details others overlooked. He did not do this to impress anyone. He did it because mastery, once achieved, cannot be argued against. She continued as before, confident that the hierarchy was fixed. Her authority depended on comparison, on being the reference point against which others were measured. He, however, was no longer measuring himself against her at all. He was measuring himself against who he had been yesterday. That quiet shift changed everything, even before anyone noticed. The emotional sting of her words began to dull, not because they softened, but because he hardened his foundation. When you know exactly what you are building toward, distractions lose their power. Her comments still existed, but they no longer defined the edges of his self-worth. He had reclaimed that territory internally. This was the second shift, the moment he stopped internalizing external judgment. Gradually, evidence of his growth surfaced. His work became precise, his thinking clearer, his responses measured and difficult to dismiss. People began turning to him for clarity when confusion arose, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Trust does not arrive with applause. It arrives through reliability. And he had become reliable. She sensed the change before she fully understood it. Interruptions no longer unsettled him. Dismissive remarks no longer closed conversations. When she challenged him, he did not retreat or react. He responded calmly, with substance that stood on its own. This unsettled her. Loud authority expects resistance or submission. It does not know how to deal with grounded certainty. Still, there was no confrontation, no public reckoning. Real transformations rarely look the way movies suggest. Instead, the balance shifted quietly. Meetings began to include his input by default. Decisions leaned on his judgment. When challenges arose, eyes turned toward him naturally. The environment was adjusting, not out of sympathy, but out of necessity. This was the third shift, the moment when competence began to override perception. Then came pressure, a situation that demanded more than confidence or voice. It demanded judgment, depth, and composure. There was no room for dominance or performance, only outcomes mattered. In that moment, he did not step forward dramatically. He stepped forward naturally. Preparedness has a way of removing hesitation. His actions were steady, his decisions clear. He did not rush to prove anything. He simply applied what he had been building in silence for so long. The result was undeniable. The room understood before anyone spoke. Reality settled what opinions never could. This was the fourth shift. The moment preparation met opportunity. Her reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A pause replaced certainty. A recalibration replaced confidence. Not defeat, but recognition. The strength she had dismissed had not broken or disappeared. It had matured. And maturity does not need permission to be seen. What defined him next was not victory, but restraint. He did not revisit the past. He did not seek acknowledgement. He did not allow old wounds to dictate new behavior. He remained consistent, focused on the work, grounded in himself, moving forward. That consistency revealed something deeper than skill. It revealed character. This was the fifth shift, the refusal to let success turn into bitterness. And here lies the final lesson, the sixth and most important shift. True strength is not proven by overpowering others. It is revealed by endurance, discipline, and self-respect. It is built when no one is watching and tested when everyone is. The world teaches us to react immediately, to defend loudly, to equate silence with weakness. But silence, when chosen intentionally, can be a strategy. Growth, when pursued patiently, becomes undeniable. If you have ever been underestimated, belittled, or dismissed, understand this: their perception is not your ceiling. Their voice is not your identity. You do not need to announce your strength while you are still building it. You only need to keep building, because hidden strength, once fully formed, does not arrive with noise or revenge. It arrives with presence, and presence changes everything. Remember this: real power doesn't shout, it waits. And when it rises, it changes everything. This is Black Bold Stories.